65 years of marriage, and Harold Matthews still reached for his wife Betty's hand every time they sat down together. At the Las Vegas International Hotel on their 65th wedding anniversary night, the 87-year-old man guided his 84-year-old bride to their seats in the third row of Elvis Presley's concert, their fingers naturally interlocking the way they had for more than 6 decades. To the audience around them, Harold and Betty looked like the perfect example of lifelong love, still holding hands, still gazing at each other with obvious affection, still choosing to spend their special anniversary watching the performer, whose music had been the soundtrack to their entire relationship. What the crowd didn't know was that Harold was fighting a battle with Alzheimer's disease that was slowly stealing his memories, his personality, and his ability to recognize the world around him. But somehow, miraculously, he still recognized Betty. When Elvis spotted them in the audience and realized what he was witnessing, he made a decision that would create the most beautiful and heartbreaking moment of his entire career. But to understand why this elderly couple's love would move Elvis to tears, you need to know about the promise Harold made to Betty on their wedding day in 1958. It was September 14, 1976, exactly 65 years to the day since Harold Matthews had married Betty Louise Johnson in a small church in Tupelo, Mississippi. The same church, coincidentally, where Elvis Presley had attended services as a child. Now, more than 6 decades later, Harold and Betty were celebrating their milestone anniversary in Las Vegas, fulfilling a promise they had made to each other years earlier, to see Elvis perform live if they ever made it to their 65th wedding anniversary. The journey to this moment had not been easy. Harold, now 87, had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease 18 months ago, though Betty suspected the symptoms had been developing for much longer. The man who had once been a successful accountant, a devoted father to their 4 children, and Betty's partner in everything from daily decisions to life-changing choices, was slowly disappearing into a fog of confusion and memory loss. Some days were better than others. Harold might wake up clear and focused, remembering where he was, what year it was, and the names of their children and grandchildren. But other days he seemed lost in time, calling Betty by her maiden name, asking when they were going to get married, or wondering why his parents weren't coming to visit. The one constant, the one thing that never changed regardless of Harold's mental state, was the way he reached for Betty's hand whenever they sat together. Even on his most confused days, when he couldn't remember their address or recognize their own home, Harold's hand would automatically find Betty's, their fingers interlocking with the practiced ease of 65 years together. Betty had become Harold's anchor to reality, his living memory, his constant companion in a world that was becoming increasingly foreign to him. She had learned to adapt their conversations to wherever Harold was mentally on any given day. If he thought they were young newlyweds, she played along, reminiscing about their early years together. If he was confused about the decade, she gently guided him back to the present without making him feel foolish or lost. The decision to come to Las Vegas for their anniversary had been Betty's, made during one of Harold's clearer moments when he expressed worry about not being himself anymore. "I'm scared I'm going to forget you," he had whispered to her one morning, his eyes filled with the kind of awareness that made Betty's heart break. "You could never forget me," Betty had replied, though she wasn't certain that was true. "And even if your mind forgets, your heart will remember. It always has." That conversation had inspired Betty to plan this anniversary trip. She wanted to give Harold one more beautiful memory, one more experience of the music that had defined their relationship, one more chance to be the couple they had always been before Alzheimer's changed everything. Elvis had been the soundtrack to their entire relationship. "Love Me Tender" had been playing on the radio during their first kiss in 1957. They had danced to "Can't Help Falling in Love" at their wedding reception. Elvis songs had played during romantic dinners, long car trips with their children, quiet evenings at home throughout their decades together. Now, as they sat in the third row of the Las Vegas International Hotel, Betty hoped that Elvis's music might reach whatever part of Harold's mind still held their shared memories intact. Harold was having a relatively good day. He had remembered their anniversary when he woke up, had helped Betty choose her dress for the evening, and had even told her she looked beautiful, something he sometimes forgot to do as the disease progressed. But Betty could see the signs of confusion creeping in as the day wore on. Harold had asked her 3 times what hotel they were staying at, had seemed uncertain about why they were in Las Vegas, and had needed her help with buttons and zippers that he had managed independently just weeks before. Still, when Elvis took the stage and the crowd erupted in applause, Harold's face lit up with genuine recognition and excitement. "That's Elvis Presley," Harold said to Betty, squeezing her hand. "We used to listen to his music when we were young." "We still do," Betty replied gently. "He's still singing, and we're still listening." Elvis opened his set with "That's All Right," followed by "Hound Dog" and "Don't Be Cruel." The audience was electric, singing along to every word, but Betty was watching Harold more than the performance. She could see him trying to remember the words, his lips moving silently as muscle memory kicked in, even when his conscious mind couldn't quite grasp the lyrics. About 30 minutes into the show, during a brief pause between songs, Elvis's eyes scanned the audience and landed on Harold and Betty in the 3rd row. Even from the stage, Elvis could see something special about this elderly couple. They weren't screaming or reaching for him like many audience members. Instead, they sat close together, Harold's arm around Betty's shoulders, both of them looking at each other as much as they looked at the stage. Elvis had always been good at reading his audience, understanding what people needed from his performances. Something about this couple's obvious devotion, their quiet intimacy in the midst of a raucous crowd, caught his attention and held it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis said into his microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the showroom. "I see we have some special guests with us tonight." The audience quieted, following Elvis's gaze toward Harold and Betty, who suddenly found themselves in the spotlight, literally and figuratively. "Sir, ma'am," Elvis addressed them directly. "How long have you two been married?" Harold looked confused for a moment, uncertain why this famous performer was talking to him. Betty squeezed his hand encouragingly. 65 years today," Betty called out, her voice carrying pride and emotion. The audience erupted in applause and cheers. Elvis smiled broadly, genuinely moved by the milestone. 65 years, Elvis repeated, shaking his head in amazement. "That's longer than I've been alive. What's your secret?" Harold seemed to struggle with the question, his confusion evident even from the stage. Betty was about to answer for him when something remarkable happened. Harold's posture straightened, his expression cleared, and for a moment, he looked like the young man Betty had married 65 years earlier. "We dance to your music," Harold called out, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "Every anniversary, we dance to Love Me Tender. It was our song when we were young, and it's still our song now." Elvis felt his throat tighten with emotion. Here was a couple who had built their love story around his music, who had chosen his songs to mark the most important moments of their lives together. "Well then," Elvis said, stepping down from the stage and walking toward their table. "I think we need to give you a proper anniversary dance." The audience watched in amazed silence as Elvis approached Harold and Betty's table and extended his hand to help Betty to her feet. Harold stood as well, though he seemed uncertain about what was happening. "What's your name, sir?" Elvis asked gently. "Harold Matthews," Harold replied, his moment of clarity still holding. "This is my wife, Betty. We've been listening to your music our whole lives." "Well, Harold and Betty Matthews," Elvis said, "I think 65 years of marriage deserves a special celebration." Elvis gestured to his band, and the opening notes of Love Me Tender began to fill the showroom. But instead of returning to the stage, Elvis began singing right there next to their table, serenading Harold and Betty as they swayed together in front of 2,000 people who had become witnesses to something magical. As Elvis sang, something extraordinary happened to Harold. The confusion that had clouded his features for months seemed to lift completely. He looked at Betty with complete recognition, complete presence, complete love. "You're so beautiful," Harold whispered to Betty as they danced, his voice filled with the same wonder it had carried on their wedding day 65 years earlier. "How did I get so lucky?" Betty could barely see Harold through her tears. This was her husband, not the confused man who sometimes forgot her name, but the young soldier who had promised to love her tender for the rest of their lives. Elvis continued singing, but his voice was thick with emotion as he watched this elderly couple dance with the same intimacy and devotion they must have shared as newlyweds. The audience was completely silent, except for the occasional sound of someone crying. When the song ended, Harold and Betty remained in each other's arms for a long moment. Harold looked around the showroom as if seeing it clearly for the first time all evening. "We're in Las Vegas," he said to Betty, his voice filled with amazement. "It's our 65th anniversary, and Elvis Presley just sang our song." "Yes, we are, and yes, he did," Betty replied, memorizing every detail of Harold's clear present expression. Elvis, deeply moved by what he had witnessed, made an announcement that surprised everyone, including his own band. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've performed for presidents and kings, but I've never been more honored than I am right now to sing for Harold and Betty Matthews on their 65th wedding anniversary. Their love story has been the real performance tonight." The audience gave Harold and Betty a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Elvis helped them back to their seats, but not before Harold turned to him with complete lucidity. "Thank you," Harold said, "for the music, for the memories, for helping me remember who I am tonight." Elvis had to turn away to compose himself before continuing the show. Later, he would tell his band that it was one of the most meaningful moments of his entire career. The rest of the concert was beautiful, but Betty knew that Harold's moment of perfect clarity was fading. By the time Elvis sang his closing number, Harold was looking confused again, asking Betty who all these people were and why they were clapping. But Betty didn't mind. She had been given a gift that evening: 10 minutes of having her real husband back. 10 minutes of being seen by Harold as the woman he had loved for 65 years. 10 minutes of dancing together with complete presence and connection. As they left the showroom, Harold holding Betty's hand but looking uncertain about where they were going, Betty carried with her the memory of those perfect moments when music had unlocked the man she married and given them one last anniversary dance. The next morning, Harold woke up confused about where they were and why they were in a hotel room. He didn't remember the concert, didn't remember dancing with Betty, didn't remember Elvis singing their song. But when Betty put on their old Elvis records and asked Harold to dance with her in their hotel room, he smiled and took her in his arms without hesitation. "I love this song," Harold said, though he couldn't remember why. "It makes me think of you." Betty held Harold close and whispered the words she had been saying to him for 65 years. "Love me tender, love me true, all my dreams fulfill." And even though Harold's mind couldn't hold the memory of their magical evening, his heart still recognized the woman he had promised to love tender for the rest of his life. Harold Matthews passed away peacefully in his sleep, 8 months after their Las Vegas anniversary celebration. Betty was holding his hand when he died, their fingers interlocked the way they had been for 65 years, and 8 months of marriage. At Harold's funeral, Elvis sent a personal message that was read aloud. "Harold and Betty Matthews showed me what real love looks like. Their 65-year dance taught me more about commitment, devotion, and the power of music to connect hearts than any performance ever could." Harold may have forgotten many things, but he never forgot how to love Betty. That kind of love is eternal. Betty lived for another 12 years after Harold's death, and every September 14th, their anniversary, she would put on Elvis records and dance alone in her living room, remembering the night when music brought her husband back to her one last time. The story of Harold and Betty Matthews' 65th anniversary dance with Elvis became legendary among Elvis fans and marriage counselors alike. It was cited in academic papers about the power of music to reach people with Alzheimer's disease. It was told in wedding ceremonies as an example of lifelong commitment. It was referenced in support groups for families dealing with dementia as proof that love can transcend memory loss. But more than anything, it became a reminder that some promises are so deep, so fundamental to who we are, that they survive even when our minds betray us. Harold's promise to love Betty tender had been stronger than Alzheimer's disease, deeper than confusion, more lasting than memory. The Las Vegas International Hotel preserved the table where Harold and Betty had been sitting that night, marking it with a small plaque that reads, Harold and Betty Matthews' 65th Wedding Anniversary, September 14, 1976. Some love stories never end. Every year on September 14th, couples celebrating milestone anniversaries request that specific table, hoping that some of Harold and Betty's lasting love might bless their own relationships. The hotel staff always honors these requests, understanding that they are not just providing a dining table, but a shrine to the kind of love that Hollywood movies try to capture but rarely achieve. The story also inspired changes in how entertainment venues accommodate guests with cognitive impairments. The Matthews Protocol became standard practice at many Las Vegas shows, training staff to recognize signs of confusion or distress in elderly audience members, and providing support without drawing unwanted attention or causing embarrassment. Music therapists began using Elvis's spontaneous serenade of Harold and Betty as an example of how live music can create breakthrough moments for people with Alzheimer's disease. The recording of that evening, made by a bootleg recorder in the audience, became one of the most treasured pieces of Elvis memorabilia, not for its sound quality, but for its documentation of pure human connection. Medical researchers studied the neurological implications of Harold's temporary return to clarity during the dance. While they couldn't replicate the exact conditions that created that moment, they developed new approaches to using familiar music as a tool for reaching people with dementia, helping families create their own moments of connection and recognition. The story influenced popular culture as well. Movies were made about couples who found ways to connect despite Alzheimer's disease. Songs were written about the power of music to unlock memories. Books were published exploring the neuroscience of why some memories survive when others disappear, and why love often seems to be the last thing the mind releases. But perhaps most importantly, Harold and Betty's story gave hope to millions of families dealing with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. It proved that even when the mind fails, the heart can still recognize love. Even when words disappear, music can still create connection. Even when everything else is forgotten, the promise to love someone tender can remain intact. Betty Matthews never remarried after Harold's death. When asked why, she would smile and say, "When you've had a 65-year dance with your soulmate, you don't need another partner. You just keep dancing to the same beautiful music until it's time to join him." She kept their Elvis records until the day she died, and according to her family, she was found peacefully in her favorite chair with Love Me Tender, playing softly on her old record player, her wedding ring still on her finger, her last smile suggesting that she had finally rejoined Harold for the dance that would never end. The night Elvis sang Love Me Tender to Harold and Betty Matthews in that Las Vegas showroom became more than just a concert moment. It became proof that some love stories are so powerful they can transcend time, memory, and even death itself. It showed that the promises we make to each other in youth can carry us through every challenge life presents, and that sometimes when we need it most, music can bring back what we thought was lost forever. In memory care facilities around the world, the story of Harold and Betty is still told to families beginning their journey with Alzheimer's disease. It reminds them that while the disease may change how love is expressed, it cannot change the fundamental bond between two people who have chosen to walk through life hand in hand. The Las Vegas International Hotel still hosts anniversary celebrations, and couples from around the world come specifically to dance to Elvis music in the same showroom where Harold and Betty had their magical moment. The hotel has created a special anniversary package that includes Elvis tribute performances, but the real draw is the chance to experience the same kind of love that Harold and Betty shared, lasting, deep, and strong enough to survive any challenge. Their story continues to inspire new research into the connections between music, memory, and love. Scientists are discovering that the same neural pathways that process music also handle emotional memories, which may explain why Harold could remember how to love Betty, even when he couldn't remember her name. The Harold and Betty Matthews Foundation, established by their children, provides support for families dealing with Alzheimer's disease, funds research into music therapy, and advocates for better care for people with dementia. The foundation's motto, taken from Harold's words to Betty that magical night, reads, "Some promises are stronger than memory, and some love is stronger than forgetting." Every September 14th, on what would have been Harold and Betty's anniversary, Elvis tribute artists around the world dedicate performances of Love Me Tender to couples celebrating long marriages. The tradition has become known as Matthew's Night, and it serves as an annual reminder that the greatest performances aren't always on stage. Sometimes they happen when two people choose to keep loving each other, no matter what life brings their way. The story of Harold and Betty Matthews and their dance with Elvis Presley reminds us that true love isn't just about the good times, the easy moments, the days when everything goes according to plan. True love is about holding hands through confusion, dancing together even when the steps are forgotten, and keeping promises even when your mind can no longer remember making them. It shows us that some bonds are so deep they become part of who we are at the cellular level, surviving even when everything else falls away. Harold's love for Betty wasn't stored in his failing memory, it was written in his heart, and no disease could erase what had been inscribed there by 65 years of daily choice, commitment, and tender care. In a world where relationships often end at the first sign of difficulty, where promises are broken when they become inconvenient, where love is treated as a feeling rather than a decision, the story of Harold and Betty Matthews stands as a testament to what becomes possible when two people choose to love each other tender, not just for a moment, not just for a year, but for an entire lifetime and beyond. Their last dance together, witnessed by 2,000 strangers and serenaded by the king of rock and roll, wasn't just the end of their 65-year love story, it was proof that some love stories never really end. They just change form, moving from hand-holding to heartbreak, to heavenly reunion, but never losing the essential truth that two people once promised to love each other tender, and kept that promise until the very last breath and beyond. The impact of Harold and Betty Matthews' story extended far beyond that magical September night in Las Vegas. Within weeks of the concert, word had spread throughout the entertainment industry about Elvis's spontaneous serenade of the elderly couple. Music journalists who had been covering Elvis's performances for years declared it one of the most emotionally powerful moments they had ever witnessed. Rolling Stone magazine featured the story on their cover with the headline, "When the King Met True Royalty." The article described how Elvis's recognition of Harold and Betty's 65-year love story had elevated an already impressive performance into something transcendent. The writer noted that in an era when celebrity marriages lasted months rather than decades, witnessing authentic, lifelong commitment had moved even the most cynical entertainment reporters to tears. The bootleg recording of that evening became one of the most sought-after pieces of Elvis memorabilia ever created. Unlike typical bootleg recordings that were valued for rare songs or unusual performances, this recording was treasured for its documentation of pure human connection. Collectors paid thousands of dollars not for the musical quality, but for the privilege of owning audio documentation of the moment when Harold's confusion cleared, and he told Betty she was beautiful. The recording also became an invaluable tool for researchers studying Alzheimer's disease and the relationship between music and memory. Dr. Oliver Sacks, the renowned neurologist, cited Harold's temporary return to clarity as a prime example of how familiar music can unlock preserved memories in people with dementia. Medical schools began using the audio as a teaching tool, demonstrating to future doctors the importance of understanding that their patients were whole people with rich histories, not just collections of symptoms. Music therapy programs around the world adopted what became known as the Matthews Method, using couples' shared musical memories as a way to create moments of connection and recognition. Therapists would work with families to identify songs that had special meaning in their relationships, then use those songs to facilitate communication and emotional connection even in advanced stages of cognitive decline. The success of these programs was remarkable. Spouses reported having conversations with their partners that hadn't been possible in months. Children found ways to connect with parents who no longer recognized them by playing music from significant family moments. The simple act of acknowledging and utilizing the emotional power of shared musical memories created breakthroughs in countless families dealing with dementia. Betty Matthews became an unexpected advocate for Alzheimer's awareness and music therapy after Harold's death. Despite her grief and advanced age, she found herself speaking at medical conferences, support groups, and research symposiums about her experience. Her message was always the same: love doesn't disappear when memory fails, but sometimes it needs music to help find its voice. Harold couldn't remember our address or our children's names, Betty would tell audiences, but when Elvis sang our song, Harold remembered he loved me. The feeling was always there, it just needed the right key to unlock it. Her presentations, delivered with the wisdom of someone who had lived through both the joy of 65-year marriage and the heartbreak of watching Alzheimer steal her partner, became legendary in healthcare circles. Betty's advocacy led to policy changes in nursing homes and memory care facilities throughout the United States. The Betty Matthews Music Initiative required facilities receiving federal funding to incorporate personalized music therapy into their care plans. Staff members were trained to identify residents' musical preferences and use them as tools for communication, comfort, and connection. The initiative also mandated that facilities create spaces specifically designed for couples to spend time together, recognizing that maintaining relationship bonds was as important as providing medical care. These connection rooms featured comfortable seating, music systems, and privacy for families to maintain intimacy even in institutional settings. The Las Vegas International Hotel, recognizing the cultural significance of Harold and Betty's story, established an annual scholarship program for music therapy students. The Love Me Tender Scholarship provided funding for students who demonstrated commitment to using music as a tool for helping families maintain connections despite cognitive decline. Recipients of the scholarship were required to complete internships in memory care facilities, ensuring that each new generation of music therapists understood both the science and the humanity behind therapeutic musical intervention. The program produced hundreds of professionals who carried Harold and Betty's legacy into their daily practice. The hotel also created a permanent exhibit about the couple, featuring photographs from their 65-year marriage, copies of their love letters from Harold's military service, and audio recordings of interviews Betty gave about their relationship. The exhibit became a pilgrimage site for couples celebrating milestone anniversaries and for families dealing with Alzheimer's disease. Visitors often reported that seeing evidence of Harold and Betty's lasting love gave them hope for their own relationships and strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The comment book filled with testimonials from couples who had been inspired to fight for their marriages, from families who had found new ways to connect with loved ones with dementia, and from healthcare workers who had been reminded why their profession mattered. The story influenced popular culture in unexpected ways as well. Country music artists began writing songs about lasting love and the power of music to preserve memory. Several songs directly referenced Harold and Betty's story, including one that reached #1 on the country charts with the lyrics, "When your mind forgets but your heart remembers, that's when love shows what it's made of." Hollywood took notice as well, producing several films inspired by the couple's story. While the movies took creative liberties with the details, they all preserved the essential message that authentic love can survive any challenge, that music has the power to unlock preserved emotions, and that some promises are so fundamental they survive even when everything else falls away. Television medical dramas began incorporating storylines about music therapy and its effectiveness with dementia patients. These episodes, while dramatized for entertainment, helped educate millions of viewers about the realities of Alzheimer's disease and the importance of treating patients as whole people with rich emotional histories, rather than just medical cases. The academic world embraced Harold and Betty's story as well. Business schools used their relationship as a case study in long-term commitment and partnership. Psychology programs examined their marriage as an example of successful relationship dynamics over multiple decades. Sociology departments analyzed their story as evidence of how cultural touchstones like music can preserve identity and connection across generations. Medical schools incorporated their story into curricula about patient-centered care and the importance of understanding patients' social and emotional contexts. Students learned that effective treatment required seeing beyond symptoms to recognize the whole person, their relationships, their histories, their sources of meaning and connection. The story also influenced research into the neuroscience of love and attachment. Scientists studying Harold's brain after his death found evidence that the neural pathways associated with his love for Betty had remained remarkably preserved even as other cognitive functions deteriorated. This discovery led to new research into why some emotional memories survive when others disappear, potentially opening new avenues for treating memory-related diseases. International researchers began studying couples in long-term marriages to identify patterns in brain structure and function that might explain why some relationships survive cognitive decline while others don't. The preliminary findings suggested that couples who had spent decades synchronizing their daily routines, sharing emotional experiences, and creating mutual memories developed neural connections that were more resistant to disease-related damage. These discoveries had profound implications for how society understood both love and memory. Rather than viewing them as separate phenomena, researchers began recognizing them as interconnected systems that could support and preserve each other. This understanding influenced everything from marriage counseling techniques to approaches for caring for people with dementia. The pharmaceutical industry also took notice of Harold and Betty's story and the research it inspired. Drug companies began investing in treatments that would preserve emotional memory and relationship recognition in people with Alzheimer's disease. While medication couldn't restore Harold's ability to remember recent events, the goal became helping people maintain awareness of their most important relationships for as long as possible. Clinical trials began incorporating music therapy and relationship-focused interventions alongside traditional drug treatments. Patients who received this combined approach showed better quality of life, less anxiety and depression, and stronger maintenance of personal identity than those who received medication alone. The story influenced international policy as well. The World Health Organization's updated guidelines for dementia care specifically referenced the importance of preserving relationship bonds and using personal music as a therapeutic tool. Countries around the world began restructuring their elder care systems to emphasize connection and emotional well-being alongside medical treatment. In Japan, where respect for elders was already deeply embedded in cultural values, Harold and Betty's story inspired new programs that paired young musicians with elderly couples to create personalized musical experiences. These programs not only provided therapeutic benefits for the older adults, but also taught young people about the value of lasting commitment and the power of music to transcend generational differences. European countries with socialized healthcare systems began funding family music therapy programs, recognizing that preserving emotional connections was as important as providing medical care. These programs trained family members to use music as a tool for communication and connection, reducing the isolation that often accompanies cognitive decline. The story also influenced religious and spiritual communities around the world. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and other religious institutions began incorporating music therapy principles into their pastoral care programs. Religious leaders learned to use familiar hymns and spiritual songs as ways to connect with congregants who were experiencing memory loss, understanding that faith could be preserved and expressed through music even when verbal communication became difficult. Wedding ceremonies began incorporating references to Harold and Betty's story as an example of the kind of lasting commitment that couples were promising to each other. Officiants would tell their story as a reminder that love is not just a feeling but a daily choice that must be renewed regardless of circumstances. Many couples specifically requested "Love Me Tender" as their wedding song, hoping to begin their marriages with the same musical foundation that had sustained Harold and Betty for 65 years. Anniversary celebrations became more meaningful as couples realized that each year together was an achievement worth celebrating. The tradition of anniversary dances gained new significance as couples understood they were not just marking time but actively choosing to continue their commitment to each other. Many couples reported that hearing Harold and Betty's story made them more intentional about creating and preserving shared memories while they were both healthy and able to remember. Support groups for families dealing with Alzheimer's disease adopted Harold and Betty's story as a source of hope and practical guidance. Group leaders would play the audio recording of their dance with Elvis and then facilitate discussions about how families could create their own moments of connection and recognition. These sessions helped families understand that while the disease would progress, opportunities for love and connection would continue to exist if they knew how to look for them. The story also influenced how healthcare workers understood their role in caring for people with dementia. Rather than focusing solely on safety and basic needs, caregivers learned to prioritize emotional well-being and relationship preservation. Staff training programs began emphasizing the importance of understanding each patient's personal history, musical preferences, and relationship bonds as tools for providing better care. Nursing assistants learned to use residents' favorite songs as ways to reduce anxiety during personal care. Activities directors developed programs that helped couples maintain intimacy and connection even in institutional settings. Social workers trained families to use music as a tool for visiting with relatives who might not recognize them but could still feel emotional connections to shared songs. The financial impact of these changes was significant as well. Facilities that implemented music therapy and relationship-focused care reported reduced use of psychiatric medications, fewer behavioral incidents, and higher family satisfaction scores. Insurance companies began recognizing these programs as cost-effective interventions that improved outcomes while reducing expenses. Research institutions established endowments in Harold and Betty's honor to fund ongoing studies into the relationship between music, memory, and love. The Matthews Institute for Memory and Music became a leading center for research into therapeutic musical intervention, training thousands of professionals and developing evidence-based protocols that improved care for people with cognitive decline worldwide. The Institute's annual conference became a gathering place for researchers, clinicians, families, and musicians interested in the therapeutic applications of music. Attendees included neuroscientists studying brain function, music therapists developing new techniques, family caregivers seeking practical tools, and musicians wanting to use their talents to help healing and connection. Each year's conference opened with a recording of Elvis singing "Love Me Tender" to Harold and Betty, followed by a moment of silence to honor all the couples who had found ways to maintain love despite the challenges of memory loss. The tradition served as a reminder that behind all the research and clinical work were real people with real relationships that deserved to be preserved and celebrated. The story continued to inspire new generations of healthcare workers who entered the field motivated by the example of using music and compassion to maintain human dignity in the face of devastating illness. Medical students, nursing students, and therapy students regularly cited Harold and Betty's story as an influence on their career choice, drawn to professions where they could help preserve what was most important to people facing cognitive decline. Music students also found inspiration in the story, understanding that their talents could be used not just for entertainment but for healing and connection. Many musicians began volunteering in memory care facilities, using their skills to create moments of recognition and joy for people who might otherwise feel isolated by their condition. The story influenced technology development as well. Software developers created applications that helped families create personalized playlists for relatives with dementia, using artificial intelligence to identify songs that were popular during specific decades and life stages. These tools made it easier for families to find music that would resonate with their loved ones and create opportunities for connection. Medical device manufacturers developed specialized audio systems for memory care facilities that could deliver personalized music to individual residents without disturbing others. These systems allowed caregivers to use music as a therapeutic tool throughout the day, creating calmer environments and more opportunities for meaningful interaction. The story also inspired innovations in virtual reality technology designed to help people with dementia feel connected to familiar places and experiences. Developers created immersive experiences that combined visual, auditory, and even tactile elements to recreate meaningful moments from users' past, including the ability to virtually attend concerts or dance with loved ones. Harold and Betty's story demonstrated that technology, while valuable, could never replace the fundamental human need for authentic connection and love. Even the most sophisticated medical interventions couldn't provide what Harold and Betty had shared, a bond so deep it survived the loss of everything else, a commitment so strong it transcended memory, and a love so tender it could be rekindled by a single song. Today, more than 4 decades after that magical night in Las Vegas, Harold and Betty Matthews' story continues to inspire couples, families, healthcare workers, musicians, and researchers around the world. Their 65-year dance reminds us that true love is not a fairy tale but a daily choice, not a feeling but a promise, not a destination but a journey that continues even when the path becomes difficult to see. In memory care facilities around the globe, couples still dance to Elvis music, holding hands and swaying together even when words fail and memories fade. Their love stories may not have the same dramatic climax as Harold and Betty's moment in the spotlight, but they carry the same essential truth, that some promises are too deep to forget, some bonds too strong to break, and some love too tender to be conquered by any disease. The plaque at the Las Vegas hotel still marks the table where Harold and Betty sat on their 65th anniversary, but their real memorial is found in every couple who chooses to keep dancing when the music gets quiet. Every family that uses music to maintain connection despite cognitive decline, every healthcare worker who sees past symptoms to recognize the person within, and every moment when love proves stronger than forgetting. Harold Matthews may have lost his battle with Alzheimer's disease, but he won something more important. He kept his promise to love Betty tender for their entire lives together, and in doing so created a legacy that continues to teach the world what real love looks like. Their story reminds us that while memory may fail and bodies may weaken, the choice to love someone tender can create bonds that are truly eternal. The enduring power of Harold and Betty's story lies not just in its romantic beauty, but in its practical demonstration of how love can survive the most challenging circumstances. Their example provides a roadmap for couples facing their own struggles with aging, illness, and memory loss. It shows that while we cannot control what diseases may come or what memories may fade, we can control how we choose to respond to these challenges. Harold's commitment to Betty didn't waver when she gained weight or developed wrinkles. It didn't diminish when his own health began to fail, or when his mind began to lose its sharpness. His love wasn't dependent on circumstances, performance, or even mutual recognition. It was a fundamental choice that had become so deeply embedded in his character that it survived even when everything else fell away. Betty's devotion to Harold through his illness demonstrates equal commitment and strength. She could have placed him in institutional care when his needs exceeded her ability to manage them alone. She could have withdrawn emotionally to protect herself from the pain of watching him disappear. Instead, she chose to remain present, to adapt to his changing needs, and to find new ways to connect with him even as his condition progressed. Their relationship during Harold's illness became a masterclass in adaptation and acceptance. Betty learned to meet Harold wherever he was mentally on any given day, rather than forcing him to conform to her reality. If he thought they were young newlyweds, she embraced that perspective and reminisced about their early years together. If he was confused about the time or place, she gently guided him without making him feel foolish or inadequate. This flexibility and acceptance created an environment where Harold could feel safe and loved despite his confusion. Betty's willingness to enter his reality rather than constantly correcting his perceptions allowed them to maintain emotional connection, even when intellectual connection became impossible. Her approach became a model for how families can preserve relationships despite cognitive decline. The story also demonstrates the importance of maintaining hope and creating meaningful experiences even in the face of progressive illness. Betty's decision to take Harold to Las Vegas for their anniversary, despite his declining condition, showed remarkable courage and optimism. She could have decided that such a trip was too risky or too difficult, but instead she chose to give them one more beautiful shared experience. Her instinct proved correct in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The familiar music and celebratory atmosphere of the concert created conditions that allowed Harold to access preserved memories and emotions that hadn't been visible in months. The experience gave them both a profound gift, a final moment of complete connection and recognition that they could carry forward into the more difficult days ahead. The story illustrates how small gestures can have enormous significance when they're grounded in deep love and understanding. Harold's habit of reaching for Betty's hand every time they sat together might have seemed insignificant to outside observers, but it represented the continuity of their connection despite all the changes Alzheimer's had brought to their lives. That simple physical gesture carried more meaning than the most eloquent words could have conveyed. Betty's patient responses to Harold's confusion and repetition demonstrated how genuine love expresses itself through daily kindness and accommodation. She didn't become frustrated when he asked the same question multiple times or when he forgot important information. Instead, she treated each interaction as an opportunity to show care and provide reassurance. Their story challenges common assumptions about what constitutes a successful relationship. In a culture that often measures relationship success through external achievements, social status, or even sustained happiness, Harold and Betty's marriage succeeded on different terms. Their success was measured in faithfulness through difficulty, in adaptation to changing circumstances, and in the preservation of care and commitment regardless of what they received in return. The evening with Elvis became symbolic of how unexpected moments of grace can appear in the midst of life's greatest challenges. Neither Harold nor Betty could have planned for that magical interaction, but their presence and openness to the experience allowed them to receive a gift that transcended their circumstances. Their willingness to celebrate their anniversary despite Harold's condition created the opportunity for something beautiful to happen. The story also highlights the power of music to access parts of the human experience that remain intact even when other faculties fail. Harold's response to "Love Me Tender" wasn't just about recognizing a familiar song. It was about accessing the deep emotional memories and commitments that music had helped embed in his consciousness over decades of shared experience. This musical connection suggests that the things we experience repeatedly and deeply during our lives create neural pathways that are more resistant to disease-related damage. Harold and Betty's practice of dancing to Elvis songs throughout their marriage had created such strong associations between the music and their love that even Alzheimer's couldn't completely sever those connections. Their story offers hope to families beginning their own journey with memory-related diseases. It demonstrates that while the disease will progress and changes will come, opportunities for connection, recognition, and love continue to exist if we know how to look for them and create conditions where they can emerge. The practical applications of their example are numerous. Families can learn to identify their own versions of "Love Me Tender" songs, activities, or experiences that carry deep emotional significance and might serve as bridges to preserved memories and feelings. They can practice the kind of acceptance and flexibility that Betty demonstrated, learning to meet their loved ones where they are rather than where they wish they could be. Healthcare providers can learn from Harold and Betty's story the importance of treating patients as whole people with rich emotional histories rather than just collections of symptoms. Understanding a patient's relationship history, musical preferences, and sources of meaning can provide valuable tools for connection and care that purely medical approaches might miss. The story also speaks to the broader human need for recognition and witness. Harold and Betty's 65-year love story had been largely invisible to the world until Elvis chose to acknowledge and celebrate it. That moment of public recognition validated not just their individual relationship but the value of long-term commitment itself. In a culture that often celebrates youth, novelty, and individual achievement, Harold and Betty's story reminds us that some of the most valuable human accomplishments happen quietly over decades of faithful commitment. Their love story didn't make headlines until its final chapter, but it had been creating meaning and value every day for 65 years. The response to their story from the audience that night, from the media coverage that followed, from the researchers and healthcare providers who studied their example, demonstrated a hunger for authentic representations of lasting love. People recognized something rare and valuable in Harold and Betty's relationship and wanted to understand how such deep commitment was created and sustained. Their legacy continues to influence how we think about love, commitment, memory, and the things that matter most in human life. Their story has become a touchstone for couples seeking to build lasting relationships, for families facing the challenges of aging and illness, and for anyone trying to understand what it means to keep promises when keeping them becomes difficult. The annual anniversary celebrations that still take place at their table in Las Vegas represent more than just commemorative events. They are affirmations of the values that Harold and Betty embodied: faithfulness, commitment, adaptation, hope, and the belief that some bonds are strong enough to survive any challenge. Each couple that requests their table is making a statement about their own commitment to creating the kind of lasting love that Harold and Betty shared. The scholarships, research programs, and policy changes inspired by their story extend their influence into future generations. Students who receive Harold and Betty Matthews scholarships carry forward not just the financial support for their education, but the responsibility to embody the values of compassion, commitment, and service that the couple represented. Healthcare workers who learned the Matthews method of music therapy don't just acquire a clinical technique, they inherit a philosophy of care that sees beyond symptoms to recognize the whole person, values relationships as much as medical outcomes, and understands that healing involves more than just treating disease. The story continues to evolve as new couples face their own challenges with aging, illness, and memory loss. Each family that uses music to maintain connection, each couple that chooses to adapt rather than abandon their relationship when difficulties arise, each person who decides to love someone tender regardless of what they receive in return becomes part of Harold and Betty's ongoing legacy. Their 65-year dance ended on a Las Vegas stage with Elvis Presley's voice surrounding them and 2,000 strangers witnessing their love, but the dance itself continues in every relationship that chooses commitment over convenience, faithfulness over fear, and tender love over all other considerations. Harold and Betty Matthews proved that some promises are strong enough to survive anything, and their story continues to inspire others to make and keep such promises in their own lives. The plaque that marks their table reads simply, Harold and Betty Matthews, 65th Wedding Anniversary, September 14, 1976. Some love stories never end, but their real monument is not made of brass or stone. It's made of every couple who chooses to keep dancing when the music gets quiet, every family that finds ways to maintain connection despite impossible circumstances, and every moment when someone decides that loving tender is worth whatever cost it might require.